It wasn't the bombs that shocked the Nazis. It wasn't the tanks. And it definitely wasn't the soldiers landing on the beaches of Europe. The moment that truly terrified German commanders came when they realized something impossible had just happened. An entire port had appeared where there had been nothing but open ocean. Not a small dock, not a temporary landing ramp, a full harbor, breakwaters, roadways, massive concrete barriers weighing over 6,000 tons each, and it had been built in days. Think about that. A military port, the kind that normally takes years of construction, suddenly floating off the coast of Normandy in the middle of a war. German reconnaissance pilots reported it with confusion. At first, they thought the photographs were wrong. Ships arranged in strange patterns, giant blocks forming walls in the water, long steel roadways stretching from the sea directly onto the beaches. It didn't make sense. Ports didn't appear out of thin air. But that's exactly what had happened, and the numbers behind it were staggering. Within weeks, this artificial harbor would have unloaded more than 2.5 million Allied soldiers, over 500,000 vehicles, and nearly 4 million tons of supplies into Nazi-occupied Europe. Fuel, ammunition, tanks, food, entire armies pouring into France through a harbor that technically did not exist. For German commanders, this realization was horrifying because their entire defense strategy had been built on one simple assumption: destroy the ports and the invasion collapses. Without deep-water harbors, no army could survive in Europe for long. Supplies would run out, vehicles would stall, soldiers would starve. The invasion would grind to a halt within days. That was the plan. It was logical, it was strategically sound, and it should have worked. But American engineers had quietly rewritten the rules of war. Instead of capturing ports, they built their own. And when Nazi officers finally understood what they were looking at, one chilling conclusion spread through German headquarters. They weren't just fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting an enemy that could build an entire battlefield from scratch. An enemy whose greatest weapon wasn't artillery, it was engineering. Everything the Nazis believed about the coming invasion depended on one assumption: that the Allies needed ports. Massive ports. Deep-water harbors capable of unloading thousands of tons of supplies every single day. Because invading a continent isn't just about soldiers storming beaches, it's about sustaining them. Every soldier needs food, water, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. And those supplies don't arrive in small boxes. They arrive in mountains of cargo. A single infantry division alone requires roughly 600 tons of supplies every day just to stay operational. Now multiply that by dozens of divisions. Suddenly, you're looking at a logistical monster. Tens of thousands of tons every day. Without a proper port, it becomes impossible. Ships can't unload efficiently onto open beaches. Heavy equipment gets stuck in sand. Cargo is lost to waves. Storms scatter landing craft. Vehicles break down before they even reach the front. History had proven this problem again and again. Earlier in the war, Allied forces learned the lesson the hard way. In 1942, during the disastrous Dieppe raid, Canadian troops attempted to capture a German-held port in northern France. The goal was simple: seize the harbor, hold it long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But the plan collapsed almost immediately. German defenses were too strong. Machine guns covered every approach. Snipers filled the buildings overlooking the docks. Within hours, the attack turned into a catastrophe. Of the 6,086 Allied soldiers who landed at Dieppe, more than 3,600 were killed, wounded, or captured. Half the force was wiped out in a single morning, and the port remained firmly in German hands. The lesson was brutal. Attacking a heavily defended harbor head-on was nearly impossible, and the Germans understood this perfectly. After Dieppe, Adolf Hitler ordered the construction of something he believed would make any future invasion suicidal: the Atlantic Wall, a defensive line stretching more than 2,400 miles from Norway all the way down to Spain. Concrete bunkers, heavy artillery, anti-tank barriers, minefields covering beaches for miles, thousands of machine gun nests, and most importantly, every major port along the coast was transformed into a fortress. Places like Cherbourg, Le Havre, Brest, and Calais became heavily defended strongholds. Massive coastal guns pointed toward the sea. Naval mines filled the harbors. Demolition charges were hidden inside docks and cranes. If the Allies somehow captured a port, German engineers would simply destroy it. No docks, no cranes, no infrastructure, just twisted metal and rubble. It was a brilliant strategy, because the math of invasion warfare is unforgiving. If the Allies couldn't secure a working port within the first few days of landing, the invasion would collapse under its own weight. Even the most powerful army in the world can't fight without supplies. No fuel means tanks stop moving. No ammunition means artillery falls silent. No medical supplies means wounded soldiers die where they fall. German commanders knew this, and they were confident the Allies would eventually be forced into attacking one of those fortified ports, because what other option was there? You can't build a harbor in the ocean. That's impossible. Concrete structures weighing thousands of tons don't just float into position. Breakwaters can't be assembled in open water. Dockyards can't magically appear offshore. Or at least that's what the Germans believed. But behind closed doors in Britain, something extraordinary was already being planned. A project so ambitious that even some Allied commanders initially thought it sounded like fantasy. The idea came from a simple but radical question. If the Germans had turned every port into a fortress, what if the Allies didn't use their ports at all? What if they brought their own? Not small landing ramps, not temporary docks, entire floating harbors. Massive structures built piece by piece in secret, then transported across the English Channel and assembled directly off the beaches of Normandy. Breakwaters made from enormous concrete blocks, floating steel roadways connecting ships directly to land, an entire supply network built on the ocean itself. The proposal was so outrageous that some officers laughed when they first heard it. Ports take years to build, sometimes decades. They require dredging harbors, constructing foundations, installing cranes, building rail connections and warehouses. Yet the engineers proposing this plan believed they could build a working harbor in less than 2 weeks, right in front of the enemy, under wartime conditions, with German aircraft constantly scouting the coastline. It sounded insane, but the more Allied planners studied the problem, the more they realized something unsettling. This insane idea might actually be the only solution. Because without a port, the invasion of Europe wouldn't last long, and without the invasion, Nazi Germany might never be defeated. So the decision was made. In complete secrecy, thousands of engineers, construction workers, and shipbuilders began working on what would become one of the most extraordinary engineering projects in human history. The project had a code name, Mulberry, and its success would determine the fate of the entire war. The plan to build an entire harbor in the middle of the ocean didn't begin in a factory. It began with a problem that seemed impossible to solve. Because Allied planners already knew something terrifying about the invasion of Europe. Even if the soldiers successfully stormed the beaches, they could still lose the war. Think about the scale of what they were attempting. More than 150,000 soldiers landing in a single day. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of artillery guns, trucks, fuel tankers, medical vehicles, communication equipment. Every single piece of it needing constant resupply. War burns through resources at a shocking speed. An advancing army doesn't just consume ammunition, it consumes everything. Fuel for vehicles, food for soldiers, bandages and morphine for the wounded, replacement parts for damaged equipment. Historians later calculated that once the Allied armies were fully established in France, they would need roughly 20,000 tons of supplies every single day just to keep moving. That's the equivalent of about 500 fully loaded railroad cars arriving every 24 hours. Now imagine trying to unload that amount of cargo directly onto a beach. Ships can't simply drive onto sand. Large cargo vessels require deep water. They require docks, cranes, pier structures capable of supporting heavy loads. Without that infrastructure, unloading supplies becomes painfully slow. A single ship might take 2 or 3 days to unload instead of a few hours. And in war, time is everything. The longer ships remain offshore, the more vulnerable they are to attack. German bombers, submarines, naval mines, artillery batteries hidden along the coastline. Every hour spent unloading cargo increases the risk of disaster. So the Allies faced a brutal logistical reality. They needed functioning ports within days of the invasion. But every port on the French coast was heavily defended. And if the Germans destroyed those ports during the invasion, the entire Allied army could become stranded in hostile territory. It was a nightmare scenario. Millions of men trapped in France with no reliable supply line. The invasion would collapse. The war could drag on for years. That's why the Mulberry Project became so critical. It wasn't just an engineering experiment, it was the lifeline of the entire invasion. And the scale of what engineers began building was almost unbelievable. The harbor wasn't just one structure, it was an entire system made of multiple components, each designed to solve a specific problem. First came the Phoenix caissons. These were enormous hollow concrete blocks. Some of them stood nearly 60 feet tall. Others weighed more than 6,000 tons. They were essentially giant floating fortresses made of reinforced concrete. Engineers constructed them in secret shipyards across Britain. When completed, the caissons were towed across the English Channel. Then they were deliberately sunk in precise positions off the Normandy coast. Once they settled onto the seabed, they formed massive breakwaters, protecting the harbor from the violent waves of the Atlantic. But even these giant structures weren't enough. The ocean along the Normandy coast was unpredictable. Storms could easily destroy ships attempting to unload cargo. So engineers added another layer of protection, floating breakwaters called bombardons. These were steel structures anchored offshore to absorb the force of incoming waves. They acted like shock absorbers for the harbor, reducing the impact of the ocean and creating calm water behind them. Then came the most complex component of the entire system, the whale roadways. These were floating steel bridges stretching hundreds of feet across the water. Each section was supported by pontoons called beetles, allowing the roadways to rise and fall with the tides. Remember, the tidal difference in Normandy can reach nearly 20 feet. Without flexible roadways, vehicles would simply fall into the water as ships moved up and down with the tide. But the whale system solved that problem. Ships could dock at floating piers offshore. Vehicles would drive directly off the ship, onto the floating roadway, and straight onto the beach. Tanks, trucks, artillery, all moving continuously, 24 hours a day. And finally, there were the spud piers. These were massive steel platforms capable of supporting heavy cargo ships. Each pier stood on adjustable legs anchored to the seabed. As the tide rose and fell, the pier would remain stable, allowing ships to dock safely at any water level. When combined together, these components formed something that had never existed before, a fully functional harbor built entirely from prefabricated pieces. The design was revolutionary, but it came with enormous risks. Every piece had to fit perfectly. If even one component failed, the entire system could collapse. Storms could rip apart the floating roadways. German bombers could destroy the piers. Naval mines could damage the breakwaters. And perhaps the greatest risk of all was secrecy, because if the Germans discovered the plan before D-Day, they could easily target the harbor components during the crossing of the English Channel. Hundreds of slow-moving structures being towed across open water would make easy targets for submarines and aircraft. So the entire operation was kept under strict secrecy.
Workers were often told they were building ordinary maritime structures. Different components were constructed in different locations to prevent anyone from seeing the full picture. Thousands of engineers worked on individual pieces without knowing exactly how they would fit together. Yet somehow, despite the secrecy and complexity, the pieces began coming together. Across the coast of Britain, strange shapes started appearing in shipyards and dry docks, massive concrete blocks rising from the water, steel roadways stretching across harbors, floating platforms being tested in secret. Even Allied soldiers training nearby often had no idea what they were looking at. Some assumed they were experimental defenses. Others believed they were temporary bridges. Only a small group of senior planners knew the truth. They were building something unprecedented, an entire harbor designed to appear almost overnight. And when the time finally came to deploy it, the Nazis would have no idea what they were witnessing.
The closer the Allies moved toward the invasion of Europe, the more terrifying the logistics became. Planning an operation like D-Day wasn't just about soldiers and ships. It was about mathematics. Cold, brutal calculations about how long men could survive without supplies, how many trucks were needed to move ammunition, how many gallons of fuel a tank division burned every day. And the numbers were staggering. By the spring of 1944, Allied planners estimated that once the invasion began, the armies in France would require more than 7 million tons of supplies within the first 3 months. 7 million, enough cargo to fill over 200,000 freight trains. Food, ammunition, spare parts, artillery shells, gasoline, medical equipment, replacement vehicles, communication gear, an endless river of materials that had to move from American factories across the Atlantic Ocean into Britain and finally onto the battlefields of Europe. If that supply chain broke even briefly, the invasion could collapse. German commanders understood this better than anyone. That's why the Nazis didn't just rely on bunkers and machine guns to defend the coast. They built a strategy around denial. Deny the Allies working harbors, deny them stable supply routes, force them to unload cargo onto open beaches where storms, tides, and enemy fire would slow everything to a crawl. German intelligence officers believed this weakness would eventually destroy any invasion attempt. Because beaches are unpredictable. At low tide, ships might sit hundreds of yards from shore. At high tide, waves could smash landing craft against rocks. Heavy trucks could sink into soft sand before they ever reached dry land. The Normandy coastline itself created additional problems. Steep bluffs overlooking some beaches, underwater obstacles hidden beneath the tide, wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, and mines planted everywhere. And beyond the beaches were narrow roads and hedgerows that slowed the movement of vehicles. German planners believed the Allies would quickly choke on their own logistics. Thousands of vehicles stuck near the shoreline, supply piles growing faster than they could be transported inland. Chaos, congestion, and eventually collapse. That's why when German commanders studied the possibility of an invasion, they were confident the battle would be decided within the first few days. If the Allies didn't capture a major port almost immediately, the invasion would fail. But Allied engineers had been studying this exact problem for months, and they understood something the Germans didn't. Ports weren't just physical locations, they were systems. Systems for moving cargo efficiently from ships to land. If that system could be recreated artificially, then the Allies wouldn't need to capture a port at all. They could simply build one wherever they landed. But the idea still sounded insane, even within the Allied command structure. Some naval officers argued that floating harbors would be too fragile. Others warned that storms in the English Channel could destroy them within days. The Channel is notorious for violent weather, waves crashing against coastlines with enormous force, strong tidal currents shifting constantly. If the Mulberry harbors failed, the invasion forces could lose their supply network overnight. It would be a disaster on an unimaginable scale.
But the engineers had already begun testing their designs. Across Britain, experimental prototypes were constructed in secret locations. Floating roadways were assembled and dismantled repeatedly. Engineers studied wave patterns, tidal movements, and structural stress points. Concrete caissons were deliberately flooded and sunk to see how they behaved on the ocean floor. Everything was tested. Everything was measured, and slowly, confidence began to grow. The system might actually work. But one final challenge remained: transportation. The Mulberry Harbor wasn't just a single structure that could simply be towed across the channel. It was made of hundreds of individual components, each one massive, each one heavy, each one slow-moving. The Phoenix caissons alone weighed thousands of tons. Towing them across open water would require fleets of tugboats, and they couldn't travel quickly. Most would move at barely 4 or 5 knots. If German reconnaissance aircraft spotted them during the crossing, they could easily become targets. Submarines might sink them before they ever reached France. Bombers could destroy the floating roadways. The entire operation could be wiped out before it even began. So, secrecy became absolute. The Mulberry components were hidden along the British coastline. Some were disguised as breakwaters or harbor defenses. Others were anchored in remote bays where enemy aircraft rarely flew. Even many of the sailors assigned to tow them across the channel didn't fully understand what they were transporting. To them, it looked like strange concrete boxes and floating bridges, nothing more. But behind the scenes, Allied planners were coordinating one of the most complex engineering operations in military history. Thousands of ships, hundreds of towing vessels, precise navigation schedules. Every component had to arrive at the exact location at the exact time, because once the invasion began, there would be no room for mistakes. The beaches of Normandy would already be filled with soldiers fighting for their lives. Landing craft would crowd the shoreline. German artillery would be firing from inland positions. Engineers would have to assemble the harbor under constant threat of attack. If they failed, millions of men could be stranded in enemy territory. Yet, despite the risks, the plan moved forward. And as June 1944 approached, something strange began happening along the southern coast of Britain. Harbors started filling with ships, thousands of them, landing craft, destroyers, transport vessels, cargo ships, warships from dozens of Allied nations. It was the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted in human history. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft gathering silently in preparation for a single moment. The moment when the greatest amphibious invasion ever attempted would begin. But hidden among that massive fleet were the pieces of something even more extraordinary. Pieces of an artificial harbor that would soon shock the Nazi war machine. And when German commanders finally realized what the Allies had done, they would understand something terrifying. The invasion of Europe didn't just bring soldiers, it brought an entire portable infrastructure of war.
June 6, 1944. The day the world now remembers as D-Day. But what most people don't realize is that the battle for Normandy didn't begin with soldiers charging beaches. It began hours earlier, in darkness, with a deception so massive that even German intelligence officers struggled to believe it. Because while Allied troops prepared to land in Normandy, the Nazis were still convinced the real invasion would come somewhere else. For months, Allied planners had been feeding German intelligence a carefully crafted lie: fake radio transmissions, double agents, entire phantom armies that existed only on paper. The centerpiece of this deception was a fictional force commanded by one of the most famous generals in the world, General George S. Patton. To the Germans, Patton was considered the Allies' most aggressive battlefield commander, brilliant, unpredictable, dangerous. So when German spies reported that Patton had been placed in command of a massive army in southeastern England, Nazi commanders immediately assumed the obvious. That army would lead the invasion. And its target seemed obvious: the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France, only 21 miles across the English Channel.
From a military standpoint, it made perfect sense. Shorter travel distance, faster reinforcement, quicker supply lines. German commanders reinforced the region heavily. More troops, more artillery, more bunkers, more coastal defenses. Meanwhile, something strange was happening in the countryside of England. Entire military bases appeared, filled with tanks and vehicles. Except those tanks weren't real. They were made of inflatable rubber. Fake airplanes were parked on makeshift runways. Wooden artillery pieces pointed toward the coast. Even fake fuel depots and supply dumps were constructed. From the air, it looked like a massive army preparing for invasion. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the area repeatedly. Everything seemed real. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of aircraft, tens of thousands of troops moving through camps. But it was all an illusion. The entire formation was called the 1st U.S. Army Group, and it didn't exist. It was one of the most elaborate deception operations in military history, Operation Fortitude. While German intelligence watched the fake army in southeastern England, the real invasion force was gathering quietly hundreds of miles away, near the ports of southern Britain, hidden under strict secrecy. More than 156,000 Allied soldiers preparing to cross the Channel. American, British, Canadian, and forces from numerous other Allied nations. Along with them came something the Germans never anticipated: hundreds of strange structures waiting offshore. Concrete blocks, floating bridges, massive steel platforms. To German reconnaissance aircraft flying high above the channel, they looked like ordinary naval debris, maybe damaged harbor equipment, maybe construction materials. Nothing alarming, nothing that suggested what they were about to become. Then the invasion began. In the early hours of June 6th, thousands of aircraft filled the night sky. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Gliders landed silently in French fields. Bombers struck coastal defenses. And then the Armada arrived. More than 5,000 ships stretching across the horizon. Warships opened fire on German bunkers. Landing craft raced toward the beaches. Soldiers prepared themselves for the most dangerous mission of their lives. And within hours, 5 beaches along the Normandy coast became battlefields: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, each one a separate struggle for survival. Some landings moved faster than expected, others descended into chaos. At Omaha Beach alone, American forces faced devastating resistance. German machine guns positioned high on the cliffs fired directly into landing craft. Mortar rounds exploded among soldiers wading through the water. Many never even reached the sand. Within the first hours, entire companies were nearly wiped out. Historians estimate that by the end of the day, more than 4,400 Allied soldiers had been killed during the invasion. Thousands more were wounded. Yet, despite the brutal fighting, the beachheads held. By nightfall, Allied forces controlled small sections of the Normandy coastline. But holding those beaches was only the first step, because now came the real challenge: keeping those soldiers supplied. And that's when the engineers went to work. Just hours after the landings began, tugboats started moving strange shapes across the water. Massive concrete blocks, floating steel structures, huge components that had been waiting patiently in British harbors. Now they were finally being deployed. One by one, the Phoenix caissons were towed into position, then flooded intentionally, slowly sinking to the seabed, where they formed a protective wall against the open ocean. Next came the bombardants, floating wave breakers anchored offshore. Their job was to absorb the force of the Atlantic and calm the waters inside the harbor. Then engineers assembled the whale roadways, long steel bridges stretching from floating piers to the beaches, and finally the spud piers themselves, massive docking platforms capable of supporting large cargo ships. It was an engineering ballet unfolding in the middle of an active war zone. Ships maneuvering carefully, engineers directing operations under threat of air attack, construction crews working around the clock. And within days, something unbelievable began to take shape. A harbor. not captured from the Germans, not built over years, but assembled piece by piece directly off the Normandy coast. Even Allied soldiers were stunned when they first saw it. Where open water had existed days earlier, now stood an organized network of docks, roadways, and breakwaters. Cargo ships began arriving. Vehicles rolled directly off ships and onto floating bridges. Supplies flowed onto the beaches faster than anyone expected. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical equipment, everything an invading army needed to survive. But the most shocking moment came when German reconnaissance aircraft finally photographed the completed structure. Pilots returned with images that confused intelligence officers. A massive harbor where no harbor should exist. Concrete walls stretching across the water, dozens of ships unloading cargo simultaneously, roadways connecting the sea directly to the beach. At first, German commanders thought the photographs were fake or misinterpreted, because the idea was impossible. Ports simply didn't appear overnight. But the evidence kept arriving. More photos, more reports, more confirmation, and slowly a horrifying realization spread through German headquarters. The Allies hadn't just invaded France, they had brought an entire port with them.
At first, German commanders refused to believe what they were seeing. Reconnaissance photographs arrived at headquarters showing something that made no sense. A harbor. A massive harbor. Floating structures arranged in perfect lines off the coast of Normandy. Cargo ships unloading in calm water. Vehicles driving directly from ships onto long steel roadways. It looked organized, deliberate, permanent. But that was impossible. Ports take years to build. They require dredging, foundations, permanent infrastructure. What the photographs showed had appeared in days. German intelligence officers studied the images again and again. Some suggested the Allies had somehow captured a port intact, but the geography didn't match. The structures were offshore, floating in the water. Others suggested it might be temporary landing platforms, but the scale was too large. Breakwaters stretched for miles. Concrete blocks the size of small buildings formed protective barriers against the waves. Cargo vessels were docking in numbers far beyond what temporary beach landings could support. Something unprecedented had happened, and the more German analysts examined the photographs, the worse the truth became. Because what they were looking at wasn't a simple dock system. It was a fully operational artificial harbor. Two of them, in fact. The Allies had built Mulberry A for American forces near Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B for British and Canadian forces near Aramash. Each harbor consisted of dozens of massive components working together. The Phoenix caissons formed the outer breakwater. More than 140 giant concrete blocks sunk into the sea to create a protective wall against waves. Inside that wall floated the bombardons, huge steel structures designed to reduce the force of incoming swells. Behind them sat the spud piers, the actual docking platforms, each one supported by towering legs anchored into the seabed. Ships could tie up alongside them and unload directly. And connecting everything were the whale roadways, floating bridges stretching hundreds of feet across the water, supported by pontoons that rose and fell with the tides. From the air, the entire system looked like a strange mechanical spider stretching across the ocean. But on the ground, or rather on the water, it worked with astonishing efficiency. Within days of construction, ships began unloading cargo at an incredible rate. Thousands of tons every single day. Trucks drove straight off ships. Tanks rolled across floating bridges onto the beaches. Artillery pieces followed. The harbor turned the Normandy coast into a functioning supply hub almost overnight. German commanders immediately understood the danger, because the success of the invasion depended entirely on logistics. Destroy the supply chain and the Allied armies would collapse. But if the Allies could maintain a steady flow of supplies, the invasion might become unstoppable. So the Nazis tried to fight back. German bombers were sent to attack the artificial harbors.
Aircraft approached at night, hoping to slip past Allied air patrols. But by the summer of 1944, the skies above Normandy were dominated by Allied fighters. Spitfires, Mustangs, Thunderbolts. German bombers attempting to reach the harbors were often intercepted long before they reached their targets. Those that slipped through faced another problem. The harbor structures were incredibly durable. The Phoenix caissons were made of reinforced concrete several feet thick. Even direct bomb hits often caused limited damage. Some bombs exploded harmlessly against the massive walls. Others splashed into the water nearby. The harbors continued operating. German naval forces tried a different approach. Fast attack boats, explosive motorboats, small vessels designed to slip through Allied defenses and strike the artificial harbor installations. But the Allied fleet guarding the invasion beaches was enormous. Destroyers, patrol craft, anti-aircraft ships. Searchlights swept the water at night. Radar scanned the horizon constantly. Many German boats were destroyed before they could get close. And every day the harbors kept functioning, the Allied position in France grew stronger. Supplies poured into Normandy. Fuel for tanks, artillery shells, fresh troops, medical equipment for the wounded. Within the first 2 weeks after D-Day, more than 500,000 Allied soldiers had landed in France, along with 77,000 vehicles and over 116,000 tons of supplies, much of it delivered through the artificial harbors. The scale was staggering, and German commanders began realizing something terrifying. Their entire strategy for defending Western Europe had been built on one assumption: that the Allies needed ports. Without them, the invasion would fail. But the Mulberry harbors had just shattered that assumption. The Allies no longer depended on capturing ports. They could create them, anywhere, anytime. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's massive coastal defense system, had been designed to stop armies from landing, but it had never been designed to stop an enemy capable of building infrastructure in the middle of the ocean. And that realization changed everything. Because now the invasion of France had something it desperately needed: a stable lifeline, a constant stream of men and machines feeding the advance into Europe. But just as it seemed like the engineering miracle would guarantee Allied victory, nature intervened. And what happened next nearly destroyed the entire operation.
For nearly 2 weeks after the invasion, the artificial harbors performed exactly as the engineers had promised. Ships arrived constantly. Cargo moved non-stop, day and night. Tanks rolled across floating roadways. Trucks carried ammunition inland. Fuel lines formed a steady river of gasoline flowing into the advancing Allied armies. The system worked so well that many commanders began believing the logistical crisis had been solved. The Mulberry harbors were doing exactly what they were designed to do. They were turning a vulnerable beachhead into a functioning military supply hub. Every day, thousands of tons of cargo passed through the floating docks. Entire divisions were being fed, fueled, and reinforced through structures that hadn't even existed weeks earlier. German intelligence officers continued studying reconnaissance photographs with disbelief. The artificial harbors were still there, still operating, still expanding. But something else was happening in the skies above the English Channel, something that no engineer could control. A storm was forming. At first, it didn't seem unusual. The Channel is infamous for unpredictable weather, sudden squalls, heavy rain, strong winds. But on June 19, 1944, the weather changed dramatically. A massive Atlantic storm swept toward the Normandy coast. Winds strengthened rapidly. Waves began rising higher and higher. Within hours, the calm waters around the Mulberry harbors transformed into violent seas. The floating structures started to strain against their anchors. Whale roadways rose and fell violently with the tides. Pontoons slammed against one another. Ships inside the harbor struggled to maintain position. Then the waves grew even larger.
Historians later estimated that some swells reached heights of over 10 feet. To ordinary ships, that might not sound catastrophic, but the Mulberry harbors were delicate engineering systems made of dozens of interconnected pieces: breakwaters, floating bridges, docking platforms. Each component depended on the others for stability, and now the entire structure was being battered by the ocean. Anchors began snapping, roadways twisted under the force of the waves, floating piers slammed against ships. Engineers scrambled desperately to secure the structures. Tugboats fought against the storm to keep critical components in position. But the sea was relentless. Hour after hour, the storm intensified, and then something catastrophic happened. The American harbor, Mulberry A, located near Omaha Beach, began to collapse. One of the floating piers broke loose from its anchors. The massive structure drifted violently in the waves, smashing into nearby sections of roadway. Whale bridges snapped apart, pontoons capsized, cargo ships anchored inside the harbor were thrown against each other. Steel twisted, concrete shifted. Within hours, entire sections of the harbor had been destroyed. Ships that had been unloading cargo just days earlier were now stranded or damaged. By the time the storm finally passed, the destruction was undeniable. Mulberry A was gone, completely destroyed. Floating roadways shattered, docking platforms wrecked. The American artificial harbor, the one responsible for feeding thousands of soldiers at Omaha Beach, had been wiped out by the storm. The damage was so severe that engineers quickly realized something painful. It couldn't be repaired. The harbor had taken months to build, and it had been destroyed in less than 3 days. For a brief moment, the worst fears of Allied planners seemed to come true. Without a functioning harbor, how would the American forces maintain their supply lines? Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were already in France. Their vehicles burned enormous amounts of fuel. Their artillery consumed thousands of shells every day. Without constant resupply, the entire offensive could stall. German commanders, monitoring weather reports and coastal reconnaissance, believed this might be the moment the invasion began to fail. Because nature had done what German defenses could not. It had destroyed one of the Allied harbors. But something remarkable happened next. Instead of collapsing, the Allied supply system adapted. Because, although Mulberry A had been destroyed, the second harbor was still standing. Mulberry B, the British harbor near the small French town of Arromanches, and against all odds, it had survived the storm. The breakwaters held, the roadways bent but did not break. The spud piers remained operational. Engineers rushed to inspect the damage. They repaired what they could, reinforced weak points, repositioned damaged components. Within days, Mulberry B was fully operational again, and now it carried the entire logistical burden of the invasion. Ships queued across the channel waiting to unload cargo. Engineers expanded operations inside the harbor. More ships, more cargo, more supplies flowing into Normandy. In the months that followed, Mulberry B would become one of the most important supply points in the entire European war. By the end of its operation, the harbor had handled over 2.5 million soldiers, more than 500,000 vehicles, and nearly 4 million tons of supplies, all delivered through a harbor that technically wasn't supposed to exist. German commanders eventually realized something chilling. Even after losing one of their artificial harbors, the Allies had still maintained their supply chain. They had built redundancy into the system, backup plans, alternative supply methods, temporary beach unloading operations, pipelines carrying fuel directly from ships offshore. The invasion had become too large, too organized, too well supplied to stop. And the moment the Mulberry harbors appeared off the Normandy coast, the strategic balance in Western Europe began shifting permanently. Because the Allies had done something no army had ever accomplished before. They had invaded a continent and brought their entire port infrastructure with them.
For a brief moment after the storm destroyed Mulberry A, German commanders believed the invasion might finally begin to collapse. Weather had done what their coastal defenses could not. The Atlantic itself had struck the harbor. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft confirmed severe damage near Omaha Beach, wrecked pontoons, broken floating bridges, ships scattered along the coast. At first glance, it looked like the logistical backbone of the invasion had snapped, and in war, logistics is everything. Armies don't run on courage, they run on fuel, ammunition, and food. Cut the supply lines, and even the most powerful army becomes helpless. German officers studying the situation believed the Allies would now face the same nightmare every invading force had faced for centuries, trying to supply a massive army from open beaches. It was slow, chaotic, dangerous. Landing craft had to ferry cargo back and forth constantly. Vehicles often bogged down in sand. Heavy equipment took hours to unload. If storms returned, the entire system could shut down again. So, German commanders expected to see the Allied advance slow dramatically. But that's not what happened. Instead, something even more alarming began appearing in German intelligence reports. The flow of supplies into Normandy never stopped. In fact, it was increasing. Every day, more cargo ships were arriving along the French coast, more vehicles were rolling inland, more artillery appeared on the battlefield. And the most confusing part was that reconnaissance photographs still showed a functioning harbor near the town of Aramash. Mulberry B, the British harbor. The storm had battered it heavily. Some floating roadways were damaged, several pontoons had broken loose, a few ships had been wrecked, but the core of the harbor remained intact. The massive Phoenix caissons, the giant concrete blocks forming the breakwater, had done their job. They absorbed the worst of the storm's force. Inside the protected water, engineers rushed to repair damaged sections. Floating bridges were reassembled, anchors were replaced. Within days, the harbor was functioning again, and now it was handling the majority of Allied supply traffic. Cargo ships lined up across the English Channel, waiting for their turn to unload. Tugboats guided them carefully into position. Docking platforms rose and fell with the tide on their massive spud legs. Steel ramps lowered, and the cargo began moving. Truck after truck rolled onto floating bridges. Tanks crawled slowly across the roadways toward the beach. Crates of ammunition were lifted from cargo holds. Medical supplies, fuel barrels, spare parts, artillery shells, an endless stream of materials pouring into Normandy. By late June, Allied forces were unloading thousands of tons of supplies every single day, and German intelligence began realizing something terrifying. The invasion had become self-sustaining. Even without Mulberry A, the remaining harbor, combined with beach unloading operations, was enough to keep the Allied armies moving. American engineers quickly adapted to the loss. Landing craft were reorganized. Temporary unloading points were created along the beaches. Special vehicles known as DUKW amphibious trucks began shuttling cargo directly from ships offshore to inland supply depots. These strange six-wheeled vehicles could drive straight into the water, swim to shore, and continue driving on land. Thousands of them were deployed. They became floating lifelines between cargo ships and the battlefield. Meanwhile, engineers began constructing something even more ambitious, a massive underwater fuel pipeline stretching across the English Channel. The project was called Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean. Instead of transporting gasoline in vulnerable tanker ships, the Allies would pump fuel directly from England to France through submerged pipelines. German intelligence initially dismissed the idea as impossible, but within months, the system was delivering thousands of gallons of fuel every hour, enough to keep Allied tanks moving across Europe. Piece by piece, the logistical machine expanded. Temporary airfields were built across Normandy, supply depots appeared in captured villages, railway lines were repaired and reopened, and through it all, the Mulberry Harbor at Aramash continued operating. Cargo ships kept arriving, convoys kept unloading.
By August 1944, the harbor had handled more than 500,000 tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of vehicles, all delivered through a structure that had been assembled in the ocean only weeks earlier. German commanders now faced a terrifying reality. Their defensive strategy had failed. Hitler's Atlantic Wall had been designed to stop an invasion before it could establish itself. But once the Allies built their artificial harbor, the invasion could no longer be strangled. The supply lifeline was too strong, too flexible, too innovative. Even storms couldn't stop it. Even losing half the harbor couldn't stop it. The Allies had solved the greatest problem of amphibious warfare. They had turned an exposed beachhead into a permanent supply port. And that meant one thing: the war in Western Europe had entered a new phase. Because once the flow of supplies reached critical mass, the Allied armies began preparing for their next move, breaking out of Normandy and driving straight toward the heart of Nazi Germany. But what many people still don't realize is that the Mulberry Harbor was only one part of a much larger engineering miracle. Behind the scenes, tens of thousands of engineers, builders, and workers had created something unprecedented, a floating industrial system capable of supporting one of the largest armies in entire history. And when the full scale of that achievement finally became clear, even Nazi commanders were forced to admit something they had never expected. They weren't just fighting soldiers, they were fighting the industrial power of an entire continent.
By late June 1944, the scale of what the Allies had achieved off the coast of Normandy was becoming clear. What had started as a desperate engineering gamble was now functioning like one of the busiest ports in the world. Every single day, an endless procession of ships arrived from Britain. Liberty ships, landing craft, fuel tankers, cargo vessels loaded with ammunition, vehicles, artillery, and food. Instead of waiting for a captured harbor, these ships sailed directly toward the artificial ports floating just offshore. From the air, the scene looked almost surreal. Rows of ships stretched across the horizon. Inside the protective ring of the breakwaters, the water remained calm even when rough weather hit the English Channel. Floating piers extended like mechanical arms from the harbor toward the beaches. Vehicles rolled off ships onto the steel roadways. Then the roadways gently rose and fell with the waves as trucks drove across them toward land. Once on the beach, military police directed traffic like officers in a giant city intersection. Convoys of trucks immediately began moving inland. Supplies never stopped flowing, day and night, hour after hour. And the numbers were staggering. Within the first 100 days after D-Day, the Mulberry Harbor system helped deliver over 2.5 million Allied soldiers, more than 500,000 vehicles, nearly 4 million tons of supplies. Fuel for tanks, ammunition for artillery, replacement parts for aircraft, food, medical equipment, construction tools, and mountains of spare equipment. Everything an army needed to survive and advance. Without ports, none of this would have been possible. And yet, the Germans had built their entire defensive strategy around one assumption. If the Allies landed without capturing a major port, their invasion would collapse. German commanders believed the beaches would quickly become supply nightmares. Ships would struggle to unload, storms would destroy landing equipment, logistics would fail. Eventually, the invasion force would run out of supplies and be pushed back into the sea. That assumption had been logical. For centuries, armies invading Europe had depended on capturing ports. But Mulberry Harbor changed that rule overnight. Now, the Allies had a supply system that the Germans had never even imagined, one that didn't depend on any existing infrastructure, one that could appear anywhere along a coastline, and one that could support an entire modern army. For the German High Command, this realization was deeply unsettling because it meant something terrifying. Even if every major port in France remained in German hands, the invasion could still succeed. The beaches themselves had become the port. And once that happened, the rest of the war began to move in only one direction: forward, west to east, across France, across Belgium, and eventually all the way to Berlin. Just as the mulberry harbors were proving their value, nature delivered a brutal test. On June 19, 1944, less than 2 weeks after the D-Day landings, the English Channel unleashed one of the worst storms the region had seen in decades. The skies darkened, winds howled across the water, massive waves slammed into the Normandy coast. For 3 days straight, the channel turned into chaos. Ships were tossed violently in the harbor, landing craft were smashed together, floating roadways twisted under the pressure of the waves. Even experienced sailors said the storm felt relentless. And the mulberry harbors, those enormous artificial structures that had seemed so powerful, were suddenly facing the full force of the Atlantic. The situation was especially dangerous because the harbors were still new. Many parts were experimental. Some had never been tested in storms of this magnitude. Engineers had designed the system to survive rough seas, but no one knew how well it would hold up against a storm this severe. Then the damage reports started arriving. Mulberry A, the American harbor at Omaha Beach, was hit the hardest. Huge waves smashed directly into the floating piers. Several of the delicate steel roadways broke apart. Anchors snapped, floating sections drifted away. Landing platforms were thrown against each other like toys. Within hours, parts of the harbor were badly damaged. Some structures sank completely. Others were twisted beyond repair. By the time the storm ended, Mulberry A had suffered catastrophic damage. American engineers inspected the harbor and reached a difficult conclusion. Repairing it would take too long. The invasion couldn't afford to wait. Instead, the Americans made a surprising decision. They abandoned the artificial harbor entirely. At first glance, this looked like a disaster. One of the 2 giant harbors, after years of planning and construction, had been destroyed less than 2 weeks after the invasion. But the situation was more complicated. Because the British Mulberry Harbor at Gold Beach, known as Mulberry B, had survived. Damaged, yes, but still operational. The breakwaters had absorbed much of the storm's energy. Many of the floating roadways were still intact. Ships could still unload supplies, and British engineers immediately began repairing what had been damaged. Within days, Mulberry B was functioning again. In fact, it would continue operating for 8 months, unloading millions of tons of cargo. Meanwhile, American forces adapted quickly. Even without their harbor, they continued unloading supplies directly onto the beaches using landing craft. The logistics system kept moving. The invasion did not stop. And in a strange twist of fate, the storm actually helped the Allies in one important way. The violent weather kept the German Navy largely trapped in port. German ships couldn't easily attack the vulnerable supply convoys crossing the channel. So while the storm damaged the harbor, it also protected the Allied fleet. But the storm had proven something important. Even the most brilliant engineering project in history couldn't fully control the forces of nature. Yet, despite losing one harbor, the Allied supply machine kept working, which meant the invasion of Europe could continue, and the Germans were running out of time to stop it.
After the storm passed, the beaches of Normandy did not fall silent. Instead, they became something the world had never seen before, a continuous industrial pipeline of war. From sunrise to sunset, and often through the night, the English Channel was filled with ships moving back and forth between Britain and France. Cargo ships approached the coast in organized lines. Landing ships lowered their ramps. Vehicles roared down onto floating roadways or directly onto the beaches. Within minutes, the next ship would move in, then the next, then another. It never stopped. What had once been quiet stretches of sand were now transformed into the busiest logistics zone on Earth. Bulldozers pushed sand aside to create roads. Engineers laid metal trackways across the beaches so heavy trucks wouldn't sink. Military police stood at intersections directing columns of vehicles inland. Convoys stretched for miles, truck after truck after truck, each loaded with something an army desperately needed. Fuel drums, artillery shells, spare tank engines,
medical supplies, food crates stacked higher than a man. Even entire aircraft, disassembled and packed in shipping crates, were being unloaded. Once ashore, mechanics would rebuild them at temporary airfields behind the front lines. And the scale kept growing. Every day, thousands more soldiers arrived in Normandy. Fresh infantry divisions, armored units, engineering battalions, communication specialists, doctors, pilots. By July, the Allied forces in France had grown into a massive army. But armies are hungry machines. A single armored division could burn hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel every day. Artillery units fired thousands of shells during major battles. Vehicles broke down constantly and needed replacement parts. And every soldier needed food, water, ammunition, and medical care. Without supplies, even the strongest army collapses. That's why the Mulberry Harbor and the entire beach supply system was so important. It turned the Normandy coast into a giant unloading station, one that could support not just a landing force, but a full-scale invasion of Europe. And the Germans were watching it happen. German reconnaissance planes occasionally flew over the beaches. What they saw was deeply troubling. Instead of a fragile beachhead that might collapse under pressure, they saw a growing fortress, more tanks appearing every day, more artillery being positioned along the front, more soldiers pouring into France. The Allies weren't struggling to survive. They were building strength faster than the Germans could destroy it. Every ship that crossed the channel meant the Allied position stronger. Every truck that rolled inland meant more firepower at the front. And German commanders slowly realized something that chilled them. The invasion had passed the point where it could be stopped, because behind the Allied armies was something far more powerful than any individual weapon, an entire ocean of supplies. And that ocean was flowing directly onto the beaches of Normandy.
At first, German commanders believed the Allied landings in Normandy were temporary. A dangerous raid, perhaps. A large assault, yes. But still something that could be contained, isolated, and eventually destroyed. That assumption collapsed, slowly, then suddenly, because as the days passed after June 6th, something became impossible to ignore. The Allied armies weren't shrinking, they were growing. Every morning, German reconnaissance officers studied aerial photographs of the Normandy coast. The same locations, the same beaches, but every new photograph revealed something disturbing. More vehicles, more ships, more artillery. The beachhead was expanding like a living organism. Roads that hadn't existed days earlier were now visible in the photos. Temporary airfields had appeared in open fields. Supply depots were growing larger with every passing day. Stacks of crates, rows of fuel drums, long lines of trucks waiting to move inland. And then there were the harbors. German analysts stared at those strange structures floating off the coast. Massive concrete blocks forming breakwaters, floating piers stretching toward shore, cargo ships docked calmly behind them. At first, German intelligence had struggled to understand what they were seeing, but now the truth was undeniable. The Allies had brought their own ports, and those ports were working. Every hour they continued operating meant thousands more tons of supplies reaching the Allied armies, thousands more men, hundreds more vehicles, more ammunition, more fuel, more artillery. The numbers were staggering. By mid-June, barely 10 days after the landings, the Allies had already landed over 300,000 troops in Normandy, more than 54,000 vehicles, and nearly 100,000 tons of supplies. Think about that for a moment. An entire army group delivered across the sea in less than 2 weeks. The German high command could see the numbers, and those numbers told a terrifying story, because Germany could not match it. Not even close. Their rail networks in France had been bombed repeatedly by Allied aircraft, key bridges had been destroyed, fuel supplies were critically low, and every movement of German troops during daylight risked being attacked by Allied fighter-bombers. Entire convoys had been wiped out from the air, columns of tanks destroyed before they even reached the battlefield. German divisions that should have arrived in Normandy within days were delayed for weeks, sometimes longer. And while Germany struggled to move reinforcements, the Allies kept unloading entire armies.
German officers began to realize the true nature of the problem. This wasn't just a military invasion, it was an industrial invasion. Behind the Allied soldiers stood the full economic power of the United States and the British Empire. Factories that could produce tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Shipyards that launched cargo ships faster than German submarines could sink them. Oil refineries that pumped out fuel by the millions of gallons. The Mulberry Harbors were simply the opening move, a temporary solution that bought the Allies time. Time to build permanent ports, time to push deeper into France, time to bring in even more soldiers. Because once those beachheads became stable, once supply lines were secure, there would be no stopping what came next. German generals understood this. Some admitted it privately, others refused to say it aloud, but the conclusion was unavoidable. The battle for Normandy was already slipping out of their control, and with it, the war in Western Europe.